After World War II, fears of spreading communism took America's Cold War battle to every corner of the globe.
It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world.
U.S. economic interests long drove American foreign policy in Latin America.
In the late 1950s, Fidel Castro and his small band of Cuban guerrillas started a revolution that challenged the desire of the United States to control the Western Hemisphere.
No podíamos estar pensando en la Guerra Fría.
We couldn't think about the Cold War at that time. And besides, we were naive. We really believed there was a certain international order. We believed in the existence of certain international principles. We believed that the sovereignty of nations would be respected.
To the United States, Castro's nationalism and left-wing policies were a Trojan horse for Soviet communism.
Up until that time, we had viewed Latin America as a distant, exotic continent with which we had virtually no relations. The Cuban Revolution changed all this.
Castro established a regime soon to be allied with the Soviet Union.
Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house.
In 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy took over the presidency, and with it a CIA scheme to send in an army of exiles to overthrow Castro as they had earlier overthrown Arbenz in Guatemala. At the Bay of Pigs, Castro's forces routed the CIA-sponsored invasion.
Castro was secure, and he was beloved by millions in Cuba, and so it was a different situation than Guatemala.
Y los gusanos, los privilegiados, los parásitos y los hijos de los parásitos que quieran enarbolar la bandera vergonzosa del crimen y de la traición a la patria, sepan que no se van a enfrentar con señoritos, sepan que se van a enfrentar con hombres.
Castro, triumphant, was eager to take armed revolution into Latin America.
An even more direct threat to American security began to unfold on October the 14th, 1962, when American U-2 surveillance planes flying over Cuba made a discovery.
It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe that the Soviets would introduce nuclear-tipped missiles into Cuba, targeted on the eastern part of the United States. They never had moved nuclear weapons off the soil of the Soviet Union. We didn't believe they would. They did.
It was my father's decision and his own idea. It was only one reason: to show that we are great power and we will
But the success of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 focused attention on the dangers of the Soviet Union's ideological expansion so close to home.
In less than 4 years, Fidel Castro, who came to power on a wave of personal popularity, has allowed himself to become dominated by Russia. Her support now constitutes a threat to Western security.
In response, the U.S. supported coups against leftist governments in Brazil, Ecuador, and Chile, and even sent U.S. troops to the Dominican Republic. Then, in 1979, Nicaragua's U.S.-backed dictatorship fell, sending new alarm bells off in Washington.
Nicaragua has become the first Soviet foothold on the continent of the Americas. A military buildup unprecedented for Central America, aided by nearly 2,000 military and security advisors from Cuba.
American foreign policy makers feared that it was creeping communism, that it was going to be Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, all the way up to the soft underbelly of Kansas.
U.S. officials turned their attention to El Salvador, where military repression of popular dissent had fueled a growing leftist insurgency. The tiny country soon became America's line in the sand.
It was said here today the decisive battle for Central America is underway in El Salvador.
If we do not act promptly and decisively in defense of freedom, new Cubas will arise from the ruins of today's conflicts.
We're not talking about an effort that is focused on a single country, Salvador. We're talking about an effort that affects an area of enormous geopolitical importance to us, the United States.
If I recall correctly, Secretary of State Haig went to President Reagan and said, "Mr. President, this is one you can win," quote unquote.
Military and economic aid poured into the country, as did American military advisors, and Reagan threatened to go further.
The White House today refused to rule out the eventual use of American combat troops to help prevent the overthrow of the government in El Salvador.
But the strategy emboldened El Salvador's right-wing government, which had already shown itself adept at political violence.
For U.S. policymakers, the case of El Salvador fits the classic definition of diplomacy, choosing between the undesirable and the unacceptable. The question remains, how far is the U.S. prepared to go to prevent the unacceptable?
President Reagan gave almost a green light to fighting this war any way the Salvadoran military wanted to fight it. The way they wanted to fight it was a strategy of massacres. And that strategy meant that the chief victims in El Salvador in this civil war were always civilians, always unarmed people.
In the end, more than 75,000 Salvadorans were killed, and there was no quick victory.
10 years later, they were still fighting. And our main contribution was to destroy El Salvador over the next 10 years. A whole generation was wiped out. The productive capacity of El Salvador was terribly damaged. And it was simply a case where our reaction lacked all proportionality. We tried to defeat an authentic revolutionary movement, and it proved impossible, even in a postage stamp country the size of El Salvador.
And El Salvador was far from alone.
For Latin Americans, always we have had the problems that we had a government of the United States looking to us and seeing as a devil any social change.
American foreign policy had supported autocratic rulers throughout Latin America.
The Reagan administration extended the official hand of friendship to another military or authoritarian government today, this time to the government of Chile.
The U.S. was responsible for the evolution of Latin America in the hands of dictators and civil wars. It was a desert of dictators, the whole region in the south, and then the whole civil wars in Central America.
America's complex legacy in the region continues to play out today.
It's hard to realize, but the U.S. government is still dealing with the consequences of what the U.S. government in the 80s did, of all the unstabilization that their policies caused in Central America, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Panama even, in Nicaragua. That failed foreign policy will affect the U.S. for decades.
Part one of the consequences is the crisis we see on the border today with immigration.
If you pursue endless war as a government policy, you will get immigrants. You will get refugees.
It's an old cliche, you know, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, but we need to look at it and say, be careful about who you support, who you get in bed with. We need to learn our lessons.